Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. Rome's Lost Ninth Legion, a republic in decay. In the last century of the Roman Republic, the old political order began to fray under the weight of empire and inequality. The destruction of Rome's great rival, Carthage, 146 BCE, brought unrivaled wealth in new provinces, but also rampant corruption and social disruption. Roman aristocrats amassed huge estates and fortunes from the spoils of war, while ordinary citizens and Italian allies saw little benefit. As the historian Sallust observed, Rome's victory in the Punic Wars sowed the seeds of the Republic's decline. An erosion of traditional morals accompanied the influx of wealth. In this climate, Roman politics split into two informal camps. On one side stood the optimatus, the self-styled best men entrenched in the Senate, determined to preserve their oligarchic privileges. Opposing them were the populares, ambitious reformers who bypassed the Senate and appealed directly to the people's assemblies. These labels did not denote political parties in the modern sense. Members of both factions came from the elite, but rather different methods and ideals. The optimatus upheld senatorial tradition and the status quo, while populares championed popular causes, land redistribution, grain subsidies, citizenship for allies, both out of genuine reformist zeal and personal ambition. This fundamental class conflict between a wealthy conservative Senate and leaders courting the masses would drive the Republic into crisis. The Gracchus brothers were early harbingers of this turmoil. Tiberius Gracchus, a tribune in 133 BCE, proposed redistributing public land to landless Romans, a bold challenge to senatorial aristocrats monopolizing land. When Tiberius pushed his law through the plebeian council over the Senate's obstruction, enraged senators responded with unprecedented violence. They clubbed him to death on the Capitol itself. It was the first blood spilled in Roman politics, shattering the norm of civic debate and foreshadowing a new age of political violence. A decade later, in 123 BCE, his younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, tried to go further. Gaius not only revived the agrarian reforms, but also sought to extend full Roman citizenship to the Italian allies, peoples of Italy who had fought for Rome but remained second-class subjects. The Senate's optimatus, threatened by Gaius's radical program and popularity, invoked a senatus consultum ultimatum, an ultimate decree akin to martial law, to stop him. Facing likely death at the hands of the consul's forces, Gaius Gracchus took his own life in 121 BCE. The tragic fate of the Gracchi had three lasting effects. It starkly revealed the gulf between rich and poor in Rome. It set the precedents of violence as a political tool. and it underscored demands, like land reform and Italian rights, that would not simply die with these tribunes. Indeed, the unaddressed grievances of the Italian allies would soon explode into open revolt a few decades later. From this restive environment emerged a new kind of Roman leader, populist generals whose personal power eclipsed the old republican norm. Gaius Marius was the first such strongman, a commoner, for Arpinum with a brilliant military record. Marius rode a wave of popular acclaim to win the consulship in 107 BCE. He would be elected consul an astonishingly 7 times, including an unprecedented 5 years in a row from 104 to 100 BCE, defying the traditional term limits. Marius earned his adulation by winning major wars against Numidians and Germanic foes, but also by portraying himself as a man of the people in opposition to the aristocratic Senate. He championed popular causes and distributed lands to his veterans, cultivating a loyal base of support. Marius's repeated consulship, achieved through popular support and sometimes intimidation, broke the gentleman's agreement of Roman politics and proved that a victorious general could bend the state to his will. His career signaled that military strongmen had arrived as decisive political actors in Rome's crisis. Facing Marius's towering influence was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician general who became the champion of the Optimate cause. Initially an officer under Marius, Sulla's own military brilliance, especially in the social war of 91 to 88 BCE, propelled him into the consulship of 88 BCE. That year, a dispute over the command against King Mithridates of Pontus ignited an open power struggle. The Senate awarded Sulla the command, but Marius, hungry for glory, persuaded the popular assembly to transfer the command to himself, a maneuver that drove Sulla from Rome. Rather than accept humiliation, Sulla did the unthinkable. He rallied loyal legionaries and marched on Rome itself, the first Roman general ever to turn his army against the capital. Sulla's bold coup in 88 BCE scattered his enemies and restored his command. Though he soon left to fight Mithridates abroad, the die was cast. Roman civil war had begun. In Sulla's absence, Marius seized Rome one last time, slaughtering Sullan supporters in a bloody purge. Upon Marius's death, his faction continued the fight. Sulla returned victorious from the Eastern Wars in 83 BCE, and for the second time, led his battle-hardened legions into Rome. After a brutal campaign, Sulla crushed the Marian forces, and in 82 BCE, installed himself as dictator, not the old 6-month emergency dictator of Roman tradition, but an absolute ruler with no term limit. The showdown of Marius and Sulla had brought the Republic to the brink. Personal armies, massacres of political enemies, and the seizure of Rome by force. The Optimatus versus Popularis feud had escalated from street violence to full-scale civil war, demonstrating that the republican system was fatally ill. In Sulla's grim phrasing, by this point, wealth, power, and military command were what Romans fought over with the same ferocity as against foreign foes. a struggle that would soon ensnare the young Julius Caesar. The Social War, 91 to 88 BCE. While Roman elites feuded in the Forum, a different but related conflict erupted across Italy. The Social War of 91 to 88 BCE was a massive rebellion of Rome's Italian allies, who had long fought alongside Rome but were denied the rights of Roman citizenship. Decades of resentment had been brewing among these Italian communities, who bore the brunt of military service, yet had no say in Roman laws. The immediate trigger came in 91 BCE, when the reformist tribune Marcus Livius Drusus attempted to grant full citizenship to the Italians. Drusus's plan provoked fierce opposition in the Senate, and he was assassinated, a signal to the Allies that justice from Rome would not come voluntarily. Later that year, anger boiled over. Tribes across central and southern Italy, Marsi, Samnites, Pellini, and others rose in revolt, determined to win autonomy or equality by the sword. The Italian rebels organized with striking resolve. They formed a breakaway republic, complete with a senate of their own, and established a capital. They even issued their own coinage bearing the name Italia, asserting a new national identity in defiance of Rome. Soon, the insurgents fielded a formidable force of up to 100,000 men drawn from allied communities. In the early fighting, 90 BCE, the Roman armies suffered severe setbacks. The Italian Confederates, highly motivated and seasoned from Rome's previous campaigns, defeated Roman forces in multiple engagements, even penetrating into the rich heartland of Campania. At this desperate juncture, Rome faced the real possibility of losing control of Italy for the first time in centuries. To turn the tide, the Roman government made a fateful concession. In 90 BCE, as battles raged, the consul Lucius Julius Caesar, a relative of the Julius Caesar, sponsored a law offering full Roman citizenship to all Italian allies who had not taken up arms, or who would immediately lay them down. This olive branch, the Lex Julia, smartly undercut the rebels' cause, peeling away support. Many Italian communities, realizing they could gain by peace what they sought by war, accepted the offer. Tens of thousands of Italian soldiers ceased fighting once the prize of citizenship was reached. Roman legions under capable commanders then pressed hard against the remaining hotbeds of resistance. In the north, Pompeius Strabo, the father of Pompey the Great, methodically subdued the Marsic rebels, while in the south, Sulla won bloody battles against the Samnites. By 88 BCE, the back of the rebellion had been broken. A few die-hard Samnite forces held out and had to be stamped out later. But the social war effectively ended, with Rome victorious. Rome didn't punish the former allies. Instead, it doubled down on the policy of inclusion. Additional laws in 89 to 88 BCE granted citizenship to virtually all the Italian peoples south of the Po River and organized their towns as Roman municipalities. In this way, the social war achieved what reformers like Gaius Gracchus had long advocated: the political unification of Italy under Rome's banners. Romans and Italians would henceforth be one people, at least in legal terms. The social war was a turning point in Roman military history as well. For one, It forced Rome to greatly expand its army, enrolling new legions and recruiting from a broader pool than ever before. In fact, historians note that a Legio IX, a ninth legion, is attested fighting at the siege of Asculum in 90 BCE, hinting at the origin of the Ninth Legion in this very war. The grant of citizenship meant that Italy's young men, once obliged to serve as allied auxiliaries, were now eligible to serve as full legionaries in Rome's legions. Legions raised after the Social War would include Romans, Latins, and Italians of all stripes, bound together under the Roman eagle. This broadened recruitment base made the Roman army larger and more diverse, but also meant that loyalty was increasingly tied to local generals and personal reward rather than old Roman civic patriotism. Many of the Italian veterans of the Social War ended up following powerful commanders in the civil wars that followed. Thus, the Social War's legacy was twofold. It fulfilled the Italian allies' quest for inclusion, transforming the Republic into an Italian nation-state, and it created a larger battle-tested pool of soldiers who would soon become the professional legions of the late Republic. Marius's military reforms. Decades before the Social War, Gaius Marius had already begun revolutionizing Rome's military, a transformation that enabled the legions to meet such monumental challenges. In 107 BCE, during Marius's first consulship, Rome was struggling to find enough qualified soldiers to fight King Jugurtha of Numidia. By ancient law, only property-owning citizens were liable for service, which ensured Rome's armies were made up of middle-class farmers who could afford their own arm. But long wars and economic turmoil had thinned the ranks of landowners, leaving Rome facing manpower shortages. Marius responded with a bold reform. He abolished the property requirement for military service, allowing landless Romans to enlist for the first time. In the past, such impoverished citizens had been used only in emergencies. Now, they would form the backbone of the legions. To equip these new recruits, the state paid for their arms and armor, a break from the old tradition of soldiers furnishing their own gear. What's more, Marius instituted pay for the troops and standardized training, turning soldiering from a seasonal civic duty into a full-time profession. A Roman legionary would henceforth be a professional heavy infantryman, drilled and supplied at state's expense, a crucial change in an era when wars were growing longer and more distant from home. Marius also reorganized the very structure and tactics of the Roman army. He did away with the outdated triplex acis formation, in which men were arranged by wealth and age into separate lines of hastati, principi, and triarii. Instead, Marius introduced the more flexible cohort as the basic tactical unit, each cohort a mix of soldiers capable of fighting in a unified formation. 10 cohorts, roughly 5,000 men, now made up a legion, replacing the old manipular legion of 120 men companies. Every legionary carried the same arms, a javelin, short sword, and shield, and wore uniform kit, which made the legion a more homogeneous fighting force. Marius even streamlined the legion's identity by instituting the eagle standard as the singular symbol of a legionary pride, replacing the variety of animal totems previously used. Each legion marched behind a silver or bronze eagle, fostering a spirit de corps, an almost religious devotion to the emblem. Under Marius's guidance, the Roman legions became tough, professional units capable of long campaigns, and the soldiers, many of them poor volunteers, found in the army a livelihood and a cause. The immediate results of these reforms were evident in Marius's stunning strings of victory. His newly professionalized legions defeated Jugurtha in North Africa, and then in 102 to 101 BCE, annihilated two massive migrating Germanic tribes that had threatened Italy. These successes made Marius the hero of the Republic, but the long-term consequences of his reforms ran deeper. By opening the legions to the poor, Marius created a new class of career soldiers who had little to return to in civilian life and everything to gain from continued service. These men were motivated by promises of land and loot upon discharge, rewards that their general would have to lobby for or personally provide. In essence, Marius's reforms tied the loyalty of soldiers not just to the Republic, but to the general who led them. The general became the patron and protector of his troops. He ensured they were paid, honored, and eventually settled on farms. As one analysis puts it, a semi-professional army emerged, motivated by land grants. These soldiers in turn became clients of their generals, who then used them to overthrow the Republic in the struggle for power. This was not Marius's intention. He likely saw himself strengthening Rome, but it was an outcome of his system. The personal allegiance of the legions would increasingly focus on the general who recruited and rewarded them, rather than on the Senate or laws of Rome. Roman soldiers began to identify more as members of various legions and generals, and less as citizen soldiers doing temporary duty. One Roman observer later noted that after Marius, soldiers were paid by their generals, so their loyalty was to their generals as much as, or more than, to the state. This profound shift paved the way for future warlords, including Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar, who would capitalize on the devoted followings of their armies. Sulla's dictatorship, 82 to 79 BCE. Lucius Cornelius Sulla exemplified the new synergy between military might and political power, and he took it to its deadly extreme. Having won the first round of Rome's civil war against the Marian faction, Sulla, in 82 BCE, had himself appointed dictator. It was a rule without precedent. Sulla's dictatorship had no set terms or limits, giving him essentially unlimited personal power in the state. Sulla claimed, perhaps even believed, that he was restoring the traditional republic, but in practice, he ruled as an autocrat backed by the loyal swords of his legions. Sulla's first priority was to punish and purge his enemies and reward his soldiers. Even before formally becoming dictator, he had begun the grim process of proscriptions, posting lists of political enemies who were outlawed and could be killed with impunity. Dozens of senators and thousands of equestrians, or Roman knights, were executed, and their property was confiscated. Sulla used these confiscated estates to enrich his followers. He seized lands from Italian communities that had opposed him and settled thousands of his veterans on those farms as colonies. This served a double purpose. It planted loyal cohorts of ex-soldiers across Italy and fulfilled the promises of land that bound the troops to him. In addition, Sulla freed about 10,000 slaves of the proscribed nobles and made them clients of his own, even giving them his family name Cornelius, creating a large block of citizens personally indebted to him. Through these acts, Sulla brilliantly leveraged military loyalty for political control. His veterans and freedmen became a living security force for the Sullan order, while the fear of proscription silenced opposition. Never before had Rome seen its internal foes so systematically exterminated, or its soldiers so lavishly rewarded at others' expense. At the same time, Sulla launched a raft of constitutional reforms aimed, in theory, at shoring up aristocratic rule and preventing another popular strongman from seizing power. He dramatically curtailed the powers of the tribunes of the plebs, those champions of the popularis, by forbidding ex-tribunes from holding higher office and removing their ability to propose laws unilaterally. He enlarged the Senate from 300 to 600, filling it with many of his own supporters, and restored the Senate's primacy over legislation in the courts. By increasing the number of magistrates elected each year, Sulla intended to widen the pool of office holders and thereby Senate members, ostensibly diluting the influence of any single powerful general. All these measures were meant to revive the old republic governed by the Senate and to check the kind of populist demagoguery that had empowered figures like Marius. In essence, Sulla tried to turn back the clock politically, while unabashedly using extra-legal force to do so. After 3 years of autocratic rule, Sulla made a stunning move. He voluntarily resigned the dictatorship in 79 BCE and retired to private life. Romans were astonished. Sulla had amassed absolute power and then simply stepped down, a gesture almost without parallel. He died shortly thereafter, in 78 BCE, seemingly satisfied that he had refashioned the Republic's constitution to his liking. Yet, the legacy of Sulla's rule was deeply ambivalent. Superficially, the Senate's authority had been reinstated. Many of Sulla's laws strengthening oligarchic control survived, but the Republic would never be the same. Sulla had shown every ambitious man that legions could make or unmake laws, and that marching on Rome was a viable path to supreme power. His young contemporary Julius Caesar, whom Sulla had nearly executed during the proscriptions, is said to have reflected that Sulla's resignation was a one-off. There is no second Sulla, Caesar reputedly quipped, implying that he, in Sulla's position, would not have relinquished control. Indeed, future warlords learned from Sulla's example. Within a decade of Sulla's death, 2 of his protégés, Pompey Magnus and Marcus Crassus, seized power as consuls and promptly dismantled some of Sulla's more onerous restrictions. The tribunes got back their rights, and popularis politics revived, because Pompey and Crassus realized they needed to appease the masses. But the underlying lesson of Sulla's era was that armed might trump republican right. As one historian notes, Sulla left a lasting impression on the next generation of leaders, such as Pompey and Julius Caesar, who followed his precedent to attain political power through force. The loyalty of the legions, cemented by decades of hard campaigns, and the personal rewards their general could give, had become the ultimate prize. Sulla had crossed the Rubicon that no Roman had before. it would not be long before Julius Caesar would cross it literally. Legion and loyalty. In the turbulent decades after Sulla, Roman politics became high-stakes contests dominated by those who commanded armies. Power was now distributed less by constitutional rank or senatorial debate and more by military force and the wealth to sustain it. The 70s and 60s BCE saw leading generals, many of them former lieutenants of Sulla, amass extraordinary influence. Pompey the Great, for example, leveraged his successes in Spain and against the pirates to gain unprecedented multiple triumphs and commands, even though he was young and had never held senior office in the traditional cursus honorum. The Senate, wary of another Sulla, tried to curb these strongmen, but more often it cooperated or capitulated out of necessity. In 60 BCE, Pompey allied with the enormously wealthy Crassus and the rising politician Julius Caesar in a private arrangement known as the First Triumvirate. This informal pact essentially carved up the Republic's power. Pompey got his eastern conquests ratified and his veterans rewarded with land. Crassus secured financial and political concessions, and Julius Caesar received the prized consulship for 59 BCE and a long proconsular command in Gaul to follow. What the Senate would not freely grant, the triumvirate seized through backroom deal-making and intimidation. Republican offices and provinces became bargaining chips among a few colossal figures, signaling that the old checks and balances had given way to rule by mighty. Amid this atmosphere, legions became personal instruments of their commander's will. The soldiers, now all long-term professionals, developed intense unit pride and trust in generals who led them to victory and spoils. Their oath of allegiance were still sworn to the Senate and the people of Rome in theory, but in practice, the bond between a general and his legion was the decisive factor. When Caesar assumed the governorship of Gaul in 58 BCE, he inherited 4 veteran legions, the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th, that were already stationed in his provinces. These legions had been raised in earlier conflicts, some perhaps dating back to the Social War or the campaigns of Pompey, and they were keen for action and reward. Caesar astutely cultivated their loyalty by sharing hardships and glory with them during the Gallic Wars. Over nearly a decade of brutal fighting across Gaul, Caesar's legions, especially his beloved 10th and the resolute 9th, became an extension of himself. He addressed his troops as comrades and won their adoration through victories, charisma, and consistent generosity. By the end of the Gallic conquest, Caesar commanded an army whose devotion to him was absolute. This spelled trouble for the Republic. In 50 BCE, the Senate, now influenced by a jealous Pompey and hardline Cato, ordered Caesar to relinquish his command and disband his army at the expiry of his governorship. They hoped to strip him of power and prosecute him for alleged misdeeds. Caesar's response was momentous. On January 10, 49 BCE, he led the 13th Legion across the Rubicon River into Italy, an act of treason under Roman law, and effectively a declaration of civil war. The old Republican rule that no general could bring troops out of his province was now openly defied. Famously, Caesar allegedly exclaimed, "The die is cast," as he crossed that small boundary stream. It was a point of no return, yet Caesar crossed with confidence, largely because of the fierce loyalty and seasoned prowess of his legions. His gamble paid off. Civil war ensued, and Caesar's veteran army quickly overran Italy. Pompey, caught off guard, found that many of his troops were raw recruits who balked at facing Caesar's battle-hardened forces. As a result, Pompey had to abandon Rome and withdraw to Greece, conceding the Italian heartland without a fight. Over the next year, Caesar would chase Pompey to a final confrontation at Pharsalus, 48 BCE, where Caesar's legions, outnumbered but far more experienced, won a decisive victory. The outcome of the Civil War confirmed what had long been in the making. A unified veteran army with absolute loyalty to a charismatic general could overcome any traditional army raised by the state. The Roman Republic's fate was effectively sealed on the fields of Pharsalus as much as in the chambers of Senate. By 45 BCE, Julius Caesar stood as the unchallenged master of the Roman world, a role made possible by the swords of his devoted legions. It had become clear that soldiers' alliances lay with commanders, not the Senate, a reality produced by the chain of events from Marius's reform to Sulla's precedence in the rewards of conquest. As one modern historian observes, the rivalry of Popularis and Optimates in the last century hollowed republican institutions, paving the way for military rule, under strongmen like Caesar. In Caesar's case, he would famously be named Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, in 44 BCE, only to be assassinated by senators hoping, in vain, to save the Republic. But by then, the old Republic was beyond rescue. Power now flowed from the legions, and the legions followed their own warlord. Against this backdrop, the saga of the Ninth Legion begins. Legio IX, one of Caesar's inherited legions, had been forged in the fires of the Social War and the expedition in Gaul. It was a product of the late Republic's military evolution, a unit of citizen soldiers turned professionals, loyal to its general and honed by intense campaigning. Under Caesar's leadership, the Ninth Legion would fight with distinction from Gaul to the Civil War, earning a formidable reputation in his chronicles. In time, it would even earn the nickname Hispana for its service in Spain, and go on to a mysterious fate that has captured imagination. But to understand the destiny of the Ninth, one must first understand the volatile world that created it. The Ninth Legion marched onto history's stage as the Roman Republic took its final bow. An army unit born of political chaos, social upheavals, and the genius of men like Marius, Sulla, and Caesar. In the chapters that follow, our narrative will turn to the first historical appearances of Legio IX on campaign. Yet the prelude is essential. The Ninth Legion's story was already being written in the clashes and reforms of a republic in turmoil, long before the Legion's eagle ever flew onto the battlefield. Origin of Legio IX Hispana. In the hazy chronicles of ancient Rome, Legio IX Hispana, the Ninth Legion, first emerges amid the tumult of the late Republic. The legion's earliest roots may stretch back to 90 BC, when a Ninth Legion is believed to have fought in the Roman Social War, a revolt of Italian allies. Julius Caesar inherited a ninth when he assumed command in Gaul in 58 BC, and this legion became one of his steadfast units during the Gallic Wars, 58 to 50 BC. Caesar's Ninth Legion marched with him across Gaul and even to Britain on his brief expeditions. They stood by Caesar in the civil war against Pompey as well, fighting at battles like Dyrrhachium and Pharsalius in 48 BC, and earned a reputation for toughness and loyalty. After those tumultuous campaigns, Caesar disbanded the legion in 45 BC, granting lands to its veterans in Italy. However, the lull in the ninth story was short. In the power struggles after Caesar's assassination, Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, reformed the ninth, recalling its veterans to service. The legion fought for Octavian at the decisive Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, helping defeat the conspirators Brutus and Cassius. For its valor, it briefly earned the honorary title Legio IX Macedonica, Macedonian Ninth. Soon after, the legion was sent to aid Octavian's forces in Spain. From 29 to 19 BC, it campaigned in the rugged Cantabrian Wars, the final push to subdue Hispania, Spain. Here, the ninth distinguished itself again in brutal mountain warfare, and as a result, it acquired the proud moniker Hispana, meaning stationed in Hispania or the Spanish Legion. Over time, Legio IX Macedonica simply became Legio IX Hispana, the name by which history would remember Rome's fated Ninth Legion. Following the Cantabrian Wars, the Ninth remained garrisoned in Spain for years, cementing its nickname. It then moved around the empire as Rome's needs shifted. By 10 BC, the legion was redeployed to the northern Italian city of Aquileia. Later, under Emperor Tiberius, around AD 14, Legio IX was sent to the Danube frontier in Pannonia, Central Europe. There, it endured hardship, overcrowded camps, and long deployments, which sparked a mutiny among several legions, including the Ninth, in the wake of Emperor Augustus's death. The mutiny was ultimately quelled, but it indicates the strain of military life for the legionaries on that volatile frontier. Not long after, the Ninth was on the move again. Around AD 20, it was dispatched to North Africa to reinforce Rome's war against the Numidian rebel Tacfarinas. The legion fought alongside Legio III Augusta and helped crush the rebellion by AD 24, further adding to its battle honors. By AD 25 or so, Legio IX returned to the Balkan region, with records placing it back in Pannonia for a time. In these early imperial decades, the Ninth Legion had already built a legacy of resilience, surviving civil wars, earning glory in Spain, mutinying and reforming, and campaigning in Africa. All of this was a mere prelude to the role that it would define in its legend, the conquest of Britain. Conquest and conflict in Britannia. In AD 43, the Roman Empire under Emperor Claudius launched the invasion of Britannia, Britain. 4 legions took part in this daunting campaign to carve a province out of the misty isle at the edge of the world. One of these was Legio IX Hispana, which was likely brought over from Pannonia by the commanding general Aulus Plautius. After crossing the Channel, the Ninth Legion helped secure Rome's beachhead in the new province. It operated in tandem with the other legions, 2 Augusta, 14 Gemina, and 20 Valeria, as they fought Britannic tribes and established control over southern Britain. The Ninth soon struck northward. By around AD 44 to 47, it advanced into the Midlands of Britain. The legion established a fortress at Lendem Colonia near Lincoln, stamping Rome's authority on the landscape by the river Witham. Auxiliary forts and smaller outposts sprang up along its route. For example, at Longthorpe near the river Rhine, as the Ninth secured territory piece by piece, the legion encountered fierce resistance from local tribes, like the Cataphilani, but it pressed on. Roman accounts hint that the Ninth engaged the warrior chieftain Caratacus in battle during those early campaigns. Caratacus ultimately was defeated and captured by another legion in AD 51, removing a key leader of British resistance. Through these efforts, by the end of the 50s AD, the Ninth Legion had helped subdue much of what is now eastern and northern England, and it garrisoned the new Roman urban centers and roads that spread across the land. But the peace Rome imposed was uneasy and ripe for explosion. In AD 60, while the Roman governor Suetonius Planinus was away attacking the Druid stronghold of Mona in Wales, the tribes of eastern Britain ignited a massive revolt under the Iceni queen Boudicca. As Boudicca's rebels' army surged in fury, they targeted the Roman colonia of Camalodunum, where retired legionaries lived in a great temple to Claudius symbolized Roman domination. Hearing of the uprising, the Ninth Legion's acting commander, Quintus Pentilius Cerealis, rushed south from Lincoln to relieve besieged Camalodunum. Cerealis led roughly a vexillation or detachment of the Ninth Legion's troops, likely the available infantry cohort and some cavalry, in a desperate effort to save the city. The scene that followed was a nightmare for the Romans. Boudicca's forces, numbering in the tens of thousands, ambushed the Ninth before they could reach Camalodunum. According to the historian Tacitus, Cerealis' legion was overwhelmed. The Britons annihilated the Ninth's infantry. The entire infantry of the Ninth Legion was cut to pieces, and only Cerealis himself and his cavalry escaped with their lives by galloping away. The victorious Britons then went on to sack Camalodunum, torching the city and slaughtering its inhabitants. This was the first major disaster to befall Legio IX Hispana in Britain, a bloody defeat in which perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 of its soldiers perished in a single onslaught. The date was likely early AD 61. The Ninth Legion had been dealt a grievous wound and was in tatters, its eagle standard narrowly saved, or so later legend suggests, by the commanding officers fleeing the carnage. In the aftermath, the Roman position in Britain teetered on the brink. Governor Suetonius regrouped with the remaining legions and ultimately defeated Boudicca's horde in a decisive battle later in AD 61, quashing the revolt. The scattered Ninth Legion was reinforced with new drafts of soldiers from the continent. Despite its mauling, the Ninth continued to serve in Britain, gradually rebuilding its strength. Petilius Cerealis, The legate who had tasted defeat would return to Britain a decade later in a very different capacity as its governor. Under the Emperor Vespasian, Roman authority was reasserted and expanded in Britain. In AD 71, Cyrillus came back to Britannia, this time wielding the pro-praetorian authority of a provincial governor. He brought an aggressive agenda to subdue the fierce Brigantes, the powerful tribe dominating what is now northern England. As part of his campaign, Governor Cyrillus redeployed Legio IX Hispana from Lincoln to York. In York, on the banks of the rivers Ouse and Foss, the Ninth Legion built a permanent legionary fortress, a massive base of stone and timber that would anchor Roman presence in the north. This fortress at Eboracum became Legio IX's new headquarters. From there, the Ninth joined Cyrillus' drive against the Brigantes, bringing these previously semi-independent people under Roman rule. The Brigantian queen Cartimandua had been a Roman ally, but internal strife and anti-Roman elements made the region unstable. Over the early 70s, the Ninth likely fought multiple engagements in the rolling hills and moors of Brigantia, northern England, enforcing Roman rule and building a network of smaller forts. In the following decades, Roman ambitions pushed beyond the limits of the known. In the late 70s and early 80s, Governor Gnaeus Julius Agricola led an army, including the Ninth Legion, further north into Caledonia or Scotland, aiming to conquer the entire island of Britannia. The Ninth Legion thus found itself marching through primordial forest in fog-laden highlands at the far end of the empire. Tacitus, Agricola's son-in-law and biographer, recounts a harrowing episode during his Caledonian campaign. One night, around AD 82, the Ninth Legion's camp was attacked in force by a coalition of Caledonian tribes. Taking advantage of darkness and mist, screaming war bands stormed the Roman camp, catching the Ninth by surprise. The legionaries woke to chaos, enemies already inside the rampart, tents burning, men being cut down in their sleep. Tacitus says the Ninth Legion was nearly overrun. The situation was so dire that Agricola, camped miles away, had to hurry to the rescue with his other forces. Bursting upon the scene at dawn, Agricola's cavalry and auxiliaries fell on the rear of the attacking tribes, saving the Ninth Legion from destruction. When the sun rose, the Romans saw heaps of their dead amid the smoldering ruins of the camp. The Ninth had survived, but barely. This narrow escape in the wild north only added to the Legion's saga of peril in Britain. Agricola continued campaigning, and in AD 83 or 84, achieved a major victory at the Battle of Mons Graupius in the Scottish Highlands. It's not explicitly recorded which legion fought at Mons Graupius, but it's likely elements of the Ninth were present as part of Agricola's army, standing shoulder to shoulder with other legions in the climactic clash that temporarily subdued Caledonian resistance. After Mons Graupius, however, Rome's policy shifted. Agricola was recalled to Rome, and the Romans gradually halted their advance into Caledonia. the vision of conquering all of Britain gave way to pragmatism, holding a frontier roughly at the line of Forth and Clyde estuaries for a time, and later withdrawing to the Tyne-Solway line, where the great Hadrian's Wall would eventually be built. Legio IX Hispana retreated from the highlands back to its fortress at York, where it spent the late 1st century and early 2nd century securing Britain's north within the empire's borders. By the dawn of the hundreds AD, Britain had settled into an uneasy peace under Roman occupation. At Aberacum, the Ninth Legion busied itself with typical duties, maintaining forts and roads, patrolling the frontier beyond which unsubdued tribes still lurked, and possibly assisting in local construction projects. The Legion's presence is attested one last time in AD 108. An inscription on a stone tablet found in York records that Legio IX Hispana rebuilt parts of the fortress that year. We can imagine legionaries carving their legion's name, Leg. IX Hisp, into the stone to mark the completion of repairs or a new construction. That inscription stands as the final definitive record of the Ninth Legion in Britain. No Roman historian of the time specifically mentions the Ninth activities or existence after the early 100s. This silence itself would later become thunderous. At the time of that York inscription in 108, the Legion was likely under strength, perhaps still rebuilding its numbers after decades of attrition, but still functional. The empire soon entered a period of transition. Emperor Trajan died in AD 117, and his successor, Hadrian, took a different approach to frontier defense, emphasizing consolidation over expansion. These transitions often came with localized turmoil. What happened to Legio IX Hispania in the years that followed remains one of history's great mysteries, a mystery that unfolds in theories and conjecture. For the Ninth would soon vanish from the historical record, leaving behind only questions. The vanishing from records. Sometimes in early AD 120s, the Ninth Legion disappears from the pages of history. Unlike most Roman legions, whose fates, whether glorious victories, routine transfers, or even catastrophic defeats, were documented to some degree, the end of Legio IX Hispana goes unmentioned in the surviving chronicles. After that AD 108 inscription in York, we have no further inscriptions or writings that unquestionably reference the Ninth in Britain. When Hadrian visited Britannia in AD 122, he undertook major changes. One significant move was the transfer of Legio VI Victrix into Britain to station it at York. The 6th Legion Victrix took over the fortress of Aberacum by around 122, presumably replacing the 9th Legion there. This implies that Legio IX Hispana was no longer in York, and by extension, not in Britain by that time. The absence of the 9th from Britain's later records is striking. when Hadrian's famous wall was built across northern Britannia in the 120s. No inscriptions related to the wall's construction bear the mark of Legio IX Hispana. The other British legions, 2 Augusta, 6 Victrix, and 20 Valeria Victrix, left numerous inscriptions of their work on the wall's forts and mile castles, but the ninth is nowhere to be found. It is as if it had been plucked off the island, erased from the scene by the time that massive project was underway. So what became of the Ninth Legion? One clue surfaced far from the foggy moors of Britannia, in the lowlands of modern Netherlands. Archaeologists have discovered evidence that at least a detachment of Legio IX was present at Novio Magus in the Roman province of Germania Inferior on the Rhine frontier sometime after AD 108. Specifically, stamped tiles and bricks bearing the legion's number, written as LEGVIIIIHISP, were found in the ruins of a Roman camp at Nijmegen. Some of these also carried the abbreviation VEXBRIT, interpreted as Vexillatio Britannica, meaning a detachment from Britain. This suggests that part of the Ninth Legion was indeed sent from Britain to Nijmegen, possibly around AD 117 to 120. Perhaps the transfer began under Trajan, or in the early years of Hadrian's reign, as legions were repositioned to meet threats elsewhere. The Nijmegen find implies that Legio IX Hispana, or at least a sizable part of it, was active on the European continent in the 120s. However, after about AD 120 to 122, the trail of the Ninth grows cold even on the continent. We do not see Legio IX listed among the legions of the Danube or the East in that area, nor does it reappear in later events. By the mid-2nd century, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 AD, comprehensive lists of the Roman legions were compiled. One such list, inscribed on a monument in Rome around AD 165, the Collar of Maffei inscription, enumerates all active legions of the empire. Legio IX Hispana is notably absent from this list. It had simply ceased to exist. Another 2nd century source, the historian Cassius Dio, later writing about that period, also omits the ninth in his references to legions, while mentioning others that were lost. For instance, Cassius Dio notes a legion destroyed in Judea and one in Armenia in the mid-2nd century, but by then the ninth's name does not appear, implying it was already gone. In sum, sometimes between AD 120 and AD 160, the Ninth Legion was removed from the Roman army's order of battle. The legion was either destroyed, disbanded, or renamed in such a way that it vanished from record. The abrupt silence is what makes the Ninth so intriguing. Unlike the famously annihilated legions of Varus in Teutoburg Forest in AD 9, which were mourned and written about extensively by Romans, or others that perished in well-documented disasters. The ninth's end went unchronicled. One day, it is repairing buildings in York. Not much later, it is as if it never existed. This gap between history and memory allowed legend to take root. Over the centuries, the fate of the Ninth Legion became a fertile ground for speculation. Were they massacred to the last man by barbarians beyond the frontier? Did they disgrace themselves in mutiny or desertion, prompting a cover-up of their very name? Were they redeployed to some distant war and wiped out there, far from their original home? No official answer survives. Later historians and novelists, confronted with the void in the record, began spinning theories to explain the Legion's disappearance. What follows are the major theories, both serious scholarly hypotheses and more fanciful conjectures that have been proposed to solve the riddle of the lost Ninth Legion. Theories and speculations. For centuries, people have sought to answer a haunting question. What really happened to Legio IX Hispana? In the absence of a definitive ancient account, numerous theories have arisen, each with its own supporting scraps of evidence or logic. The fate of the ninth has been imagined and reimagined in many forms. Here we explore the prominent theories, from mainstream scholarly interpretations to speculative and fringe ideas. Lost in the North. One long-standing theory posits that the Ninth Legion met its end on the windswept battlefields of northern Britain. Essentially, that it was annihilated by British tribes in an uprising, either in Britain's unconquered north or in a rebellion within the Roman province. This idea originated in the 19th century and has proven enduring. The esteemed German historian Theodor Mommsen was one of the first to articulate it. In the 1850s, Mommsen speculated that around AD 117 or 118, soon after Emperor Hadrian's accession, the Brigantes or other northern tribes launched a ferocious revolt against Roman rule. In Mommsen's reconstruction, the rebels struck at the Roman fortress of York and wiped out the entire Ninth Legion stationed there. He suggested that this disaster, the slaughter of an entire legion in Britain, was the catalyst for Hadrian's famous visit to the province in AD 122, and the subsequent construction of Hadrian's wall to contain the threat. With his formidable scholarly reputation, Mommsen's view became widely accepted for decades. It painted a dramatic picture. Imagine the fort at York under siege. By rampaging Britons, the walls breached, and the legion cut down to the last man amid the smoking ruins. Mommsen even referenced the Ninth's earlier misfortune under Boudica to underline its tragic destiny. Under Hadrian, there was a terrible catastrophe here, he wrote, referring to York. Apparently, an attack on the fortress and the annihilation of the legion stationed there, the very same Ninth that had fought so unluckily in the Boudican revolt. In essence, the Ninth Legion, having survived Boudica and Caledonian night attacks, finally succumbed to one rebellion too many in Britannia. This theory was vividly brought to life in later imaginations. In the mid-20th century, novelist Rosemary Sutcliffe took Mumson's idea a step further. In her influential 1954 historical novel, The Eagle of the Ninth, she told of the Ninth marching north of Hadrian's Wall into Caledonia and disappearing there, never to be heard of again. Sutcliffe's story centered on a young officer searching for the lost legion's eagle standard beyond the mist. While fiction, the novel imprinted the notion of the Ninth Legion's disastrous last stand in the far north onto the popular consciousness. It effectively cemented the legend. The Ninth was destroyed by savage tribes in Scotland, leaving behind only whispers and a lost eagle. Many later retellings, films, and references, from the movie Centurion 2010 to The Eagle 2011, adopted this scenario of the Ninth dying in Caledonia at the edge of the known world. But is there evidence to support the lost in the North theory? There are a few clues that lend it plausibility. First, the Roman historian Fronto, in a letter written in the AD 160s, mentions that under the rule of Emperor Hadrian, what a number of soldiers were killed by the Britons. This implies that during Hadrian's reign, 117 to 138 AD, there was significant bloodshed in Britain, far beyond normal frontier skirmishes. If a legion had been massacred, Fronto's comment fits. It notably pairs British losses with heavy losses in Judea under Hadrian, the Bar Kokhba revolt, suggesting Britain too saw a major conflict under that emperor. Some historians interpret this as evidence of a war in Britain around AD 119 to 121, during the early years of Hadrian, in which the Ninth Legion could have been destroyed. Indeed, if an entire legion was lost, it would explain why Hadrian decided to reinforce the province by sending 6 victrix and to build a continuous wall across the frontier as a drastic defensive measure. Additionally, archaeological signs hint at turmoil in northern Britain in that period. Construction of Hadrian's Wall itself, begun in AD 122, may be seen as Rome's response to recent unrest. South of the wall's line, at a site called Burnswork in southern Scotland, there are peculiar siege works and thousands of Roman weapons remnants, suggesting a large-scale conflict or military exercise in the early 2nd century. Some scholars have wondered if Burnswork was the site of an actual battle during a war with northern tribes in Hadrian's time, potentially related to the Ninth's fate. Moreover, the total lack of Ninth Legion inscriptions on Hadrian's walls, despite the other legions leaving many, strongly implies the Ninth wasn't around to help build it. If the Ninth had been destroyed in a northern uprising circa 119 to 121, it would neatly account for why they vanished and needed replacement just as the wall was being planned. One modern proponent of a British battlefield end for the Ninth is archaeologist Nick Hodgson, who, in 2021, argued that the Legion most likely perished in a war in Britain during Hadrian's reign. Re-examining inscriptive evidence, Hodgson suggests the Hadrianic War scenario is more convincing than later dates theories. He notes, for instance, that dedications by Legio VI Victrix on rebuilding projects at Hadrian's Wall could date to much later, around 158 AD, possibly meaning 6 Victrix wasn't present at the initial wall construction either. This could imply that Hadrian's Wall's first phase might have been built amid ongoing conflict, perhaps by vexellations of multiple units, while the legionary situation was in flux. In any case, Hodgson concludes that a catastrophic defeat in northern Britain remains the best explanation for the Ninth's disappearance. Essentially, a revival of Mommsen's original idea, refined with modern evidence. The Northern Annihilation theory thus remains very compelling. We envision the Ninth Legion marching out from York into the wild one last time, perhaps heading up to put down a brewing rebellion among the Brigantes, or to preemptively strike hostile tribes beyond the frontier. Perhaps somewhere beyond the River Tweed, or along the misty Caledonian hills, the legion fell into an ambush, or was encircled by hordes of warriors painting themselves for war. In the end, perhaps 5,000 Roman legionaries of the Ninth were cut down, scattered on a cold moorland, their eagle standard lost to a barbarian chieftain's trophy collection. This is the romantic and tragic vision. While not proven, it aligns eerily well with the silence of history. For had the Ninth died to the last man in an undocumented frontier war, Rome might simply have swept the disaster under the rug and quietly raised another legion to take its place. The Hadrianic Wars, an unseen uprising in the south? A different twist on the Lost in Britain theme has emerged from recent archaeological interpretations. Instead of perishing in the far north, what if the Ninth Legion met its end in a rebellion closer to home, possibly even in Britain's provincial capital, Londinium? This hypothesis is tied to the idea of a Hadrianic War in Britain's south, essentially a large-scale insurrection that coincided with Hadrian's ascension around AD 117. It's a more speculative scenario that gained attention due to the work of archaeologist Dominic Perring, who noticed some puzzling evidence of destruction in London dating to the early 2nd century. 3 pieces of evidence underpin this theory. First, a significant number of human skulls were found in the upper layers of the Walbrook River in London. The Walbrook is a stream that ran through Roman Londinium, and while some skull deposits can be ritual or other in nature, these were interpreted by Perring as possibly the remains of victims of violence, maybe executed persons or battle casualties dumped in the river during unrest. Second, there is a thick burning layer in Londinium's archaeological strata around the Hadrianic period, basically signs of a large fire that swept the city. This fire, dated roughly to the late 110s or early 120s, could indicate rioting or fighting in the city though fires could also occur accidentally. Third, around the same time, the Romans built a new fortified compound at London's Cripplegate, sized for vexillation, a detachment of several hundred soldiers. The construction of a fort within the city, shortly after a fire and amid skulls turning up in the river, hints that the authorities felt the need for a stronger garrison or safe haven in London, as if expecting trouble. From these clues, Peering proposed that London itself may have been the epicenter of a violent event during Hadrian's rule, an event on par with the Boudiccan revolt some 60 years earlier. Perhaps some faction of Britons, or even disaffected Roman troops, caused a conflagration in the capital. In Simon Iliad's analysis of this theory, two intriguing scenarios were considered if such a Hadrianic war occurred. 1. The Ninth Legion, frustrated or caught up in political strife after Hadrian's accession, might have itself mutinied in London, essentially rising in revolt against Rome's authorities, only to be brutally suppressed, with the legion's troops slaughtered and beheaded, hence skulls in the Walbrook. In this scenario, the Ninth's demise would be a damnatio memoriae, a disgraceful rebellion stricken from official history in shame. 2. Alternatively, there was a native uprising or urban revolt in London that the Ninth Legion was sent to crush, but the legion was ambushed in the city's streets and destroyed in the chaos. The legion's soldiers might have been killed in fierce fighting amid the burning city, their heads perhaps displayed by rebels and tossed into the river, a grim echo of urban warfare. In either scenario, the Ninth would have been effectively wiped out in Britain's own capital, rather than on a distant frontier. After the dust settled, Rome would have urgently needed to cover up the disaster and restore order, explaining why the Sixth Legion was brought in and a new fort was built in London. The theory is admittedly speculative. It relies on interpreting archaeological evidence in a specific way. Many historians remain cautious about concluding a full legion perished in London with so little direct documentation. However, it's an imaginative hypothesis that tries to account for the Ninth's disappearance in a less conventional way. It also introduces the tantalizing possibility that the Ninth's end was tied not to foreign barbarians, but to internal strife, either treachery within their own ranks, or a deadly assignment that went horribly wrong in an uprising. One aspect lending this theory a whiff of plausibility is the known instability of the era around 117 to 118 AD. Hadrian's rise to power was accompanied by the need to consolidate an overextended empire. Some legions, for example, in the east, were restless due to Trajan's recent wars. It's not inconceivable that in a remote province like Britain, some troops or local factions took advantage of the imperial transition to rebel. If the Ninth Legion was caught up in such turmoil, the Roman administration might have chosen to strike the legion's name from records out of ignominy, particularly if the legion had disgraced itself by rebelling. This kind of erasure had precedents. For instance, Legio XXII Deotariana Another legion that vanished, likely in the Jewish Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 AD, was left off subsequent legion lists without fanfare. While no ancient writers describe a London revolt circa 119, later legends, curiously, arose about ghosts of Roman soldiers in London's Walbrook Stream, possibly echoing some memory of violence. Such stories are tenuous, but they show how gaps in history breed folklore. If indeed the ninth met its end amid the smoke and screams of a beleaguered Londinium, its eagle, perhaps lost in the Thames, and its legionaries' bones scattered under the burned rubbles, it would be a dramatic and ironic twist. The legion that had fought so many frontier battles would have perished in the very heart of Roman Britain. As of now, the Hadrianic War hypothesis remains an intriguing conjecture. It attempts to answer why evidence of widespread conflict is seen in Britain around Hadrian's time, without a recorded foreign war. Future digs in London or elsewhere might yet clarify whether a major conflict happened around 120 AD. If it did, perhaps Legio IX Hispana played a tragic starring role. Whether as traitors or sacrifices, we may never know. This theory, while fringe, compared to the northern battle idea, underscores how mysterious the ninth's fate is. Even the capital city is not ruled out at its graves. Dispatched elsewhere, Eastern adventures and disappearances. Another class of theories removes Legio IX Hispana entirely from Britain and looks to the wider empire for its fate. These theories suggest that the Ninth Legion was transferred to another theater of war somewhere in the empire, perhaps to the troubled East, and was destroyed there. The impetus for moving the Ninth could have been a need for experienced legion in major conflicts that erupted after 120 AD. We know that by 122, the Ninth was gone from Britain. It is conceivable it was reassigned rather than lost at that point. If so, several conflicts in the 2nd century's middle decades become candidates for where it ultimately fell. One prominent suggestion is the Second Jewish War in Judea, AD 132 to 136. This was a massive Jewish uprising against Rome, which broke out during Hadrian's reign. The revolt was ferocious and costly. The Romans eventually prevailed, but with heavy losses. It is known that one legion, Legio XXII Deotariana, based in Egypt, disappeared from the record around this time and is believed to have been destroyed in Judea. Some have theorized that perhaps the Ninth Legion, no longer needed in Britain after 122, was sent to Judea as an extra reinforcement, and likewise was annihilated by Bar Kokhba's rebels. The appeal of this theory lies partly in solving two mysteries at once. If both the 9th and the 22nd Legion vanished by 136, perhaps both fell into that cataclysmic war. In support of this idea, we note that later lists of legions, like that of Marcus Aurelius, omit 9th Hispana and 22nd Deotariana alike, suggesting neither existed by the late 130s. However, there is no direct evidence that the 9th was ever in Judea, No inscriptions or records link Legio IX to the fighting there, whereas other legions involved, like 10 Fretensis, 6 Ferrata, are well attested. It remains a possibility based largely on circumstantial reasoning. If a legion was needed and disappeared, maybe it was the 9th. Another, perhaps more dramatic, suggestion is the Roman-Parthian War of AD 161 to 166 in the East. At the beginning of Emperor Marcus Aurelius's reign, co-ruled with Lucius Verus, a major war erupted with Parthia, Rome's great enemy in the East, over Armenia. In AD 161, not long after war commenced, a disaster struck the Romans. The governor of Cappadocia, a general named Marcus Sedatius Severinius, led a legion into Armenia to retaliate against a Parthian incursion. According to the ancient writer Cassius Dio, Severinius was deluded by a false prophecy into thinking he could easily defeat the Parthians. He marched his legion to a town called Elegia, near the Armenian border. There, the legion was ambushed and surrounded by a large Parthian force under King Vologases IV's general Chorois. After a brief siege of 3 days, Severinus, realizing all hope was lost, committed suicide, and the entire legion was massacred. Sources speak of some 5,000 to 6,000 Roman soldiers killed. Effectively, an entire legion wiped out to the last man. This defeat at Elegia was a humiliation for Rome, initiating a grave war that would eventually see the Roman regroup and take revenge. Crucially, Dio does not name the legion that perished with Severinius, but later writers and some modern historians have speculated that this legion could have been none other than Legio IX Hispana. The reasoning is partly by elimination. By the late AD 150s, the 9th is the only legion unaccounted for. Other legions stationed in the east at that time, such as 12 Fulminata in Cappadocia or 16 Flavia, are known to have survived past 161, so they weren't completely destroyed. The 9th, if it still existed circa 160, might have been moved into position as an extra legion for the Parthian conflict and met its end at Elegia. Some scholars find it intriguing that Dio, or the epitomizer of Dio's text, even allows the identification. One translation of Dio's fragment explicitly says Severinius led a legion, perhaps the 9th Hispana, into Armenia. The notion that the lost 9th ended up in Armenia instead of Britain adds a far-flung twist to the tale. From the misty highlands of Caledonia to the sun-baked plains by the Euphrates. If true, this scenario has certain poetic symmetry with history. Over a century earlier, in 53 BC, a Roman force, led by Crassus, had been annihilated by Parthians at Carrhae, scattering Roman prisoners as far as Central Asia. Now, in 161 AD, another legion might have been annihilated in a distant eastern land, its banner trampled into the dust of Armenia. A record notes that after this episode, Marcus Aurelius had to send new legions from Europe to the east to reinforce the front, underscoring how serious the losses were. In addition, the contemporary writer Fronto, while encouraging the co-emperor Lucius Verus, alludes to Roman setbacks and recalls that a consular or governor was taken prisoner in Dacia under Trajan, and a consular was slain by the Parthians in Mesopotamia. The latter likely refers to Severinus. Fronto then encourages that just as those earlier disasters were overcome, so too will current troubles, which may hint that a legion lost under Severinus, potentially the ninth, was considered one of those surmountable sorrows. Against the Arminian theory stands, again, the lack of concrete evidence that the ninth was there. No tombstones of 9th Legion veterans turning up in Syria, no mention of Legio IX in any accounts of that war, whereas Legio X Gemina, for instance, is documented to have come from Europe to help. Proponents argue that by 161, the ninth might have been a skeleton unit or merged with another. Thus, its identity was obscured in records, even if its men fought and died at Alagia. Detractors note that it seems odd for the ninth not to be listed anywhere between 122 and 161 if it still existed. One might expect at least a mention in passing. Another possible, though less favored idea, is that the ninth could have been lost in some conflict on the European frontiers, such as along the Rhine or the Danube, after leaving Britain. However, historians like Simon Elliot consider this highly unlikely. The main conflict on the Danube in the mid-2nd century was the Marcomannic Wars, circa 166 to 180, when Germanic tribes invaded Roman territory. By that time, the ninth was definitely gone from the legion list. To posit the ninth fought in those wars, it would have had to survive unmentioned into the 160s, which conflicts with other evidence. There was also an earlier crisis around AD 135 along the Danube in Rhine, when some legion movements occurred, but again, no hint of the ninth's involvement appears in inscriptions. Only the known legions are counted. Moreover, tile stamps and Nejmejen suggest any ninth presence there was just a detachment, not the whole legion permanently transferred. That detachment might have returned to Britannia or moved on. It doesn't confirm a full redeployment to European war. One can also consider Emperor Trajan's Parthian War, AD 115 to 117, and the associated Kitos War, 115 to 117, a lesser-known series of Jewish diasporic revolts in Cyprus, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, as possible arenas where the ninth could have been sent from Britain and suffered losses. Trajan's campaign were contemporaneous with the last epigraphic evidence of the ninth in 108. If Trajan had indeed needed extra legions for his ambitious invasion of Mesopotamia, he could have drawn one from a peaceful province like Britain around 113 to 115. Some scholars have indeed speculated the ninth left Britain before Hadrian's reign, perhaps to join Trajan's eastern adventures. However, Trajan's war, while hard fought, did not record the destruction of an entire legion. Thus, if the ninth participated, it probably wasn't wiped out there, but it could have been badly depleted. Among these Eastern theory variations, the Allergia-Parthian War of 161 scenario stands out as the most tantalizing, since a definite legion was lost there, and the ninth fits the profile. It has been championed by some modern scholars, like Menachem Moore and Werner Eck, who examined a newly found military diploma from 160 AD suggesting which legion were still active, and deduced the ninth might have been the one missing by 161. They admit, though, there is no way of confirming or rejecting this line of thought. It remains conjecture built on an absence. In essence, the Eastern deployment theories allow that Legio IX Hispana might not have had a glorious Custer last stand moment in Britain at all, but instead faded away in distant provinces, victim to the deadly wars that ravaged Rome's eastern and southern frontiers in the 2nd century. If the legion was transferred, its identity could have been lost due to bureaucratic reshuffling or merging with another legion after losses. For example, one fringe suggestion is that survivors of the ninth, after a disaster, were amalgamated into another legion, and thus the number 9 was retired without fanfare. Ultimately, while the Eastern theories are plausible, and some are backed by hints, like Cassius Dios's account of a lost legion in Armenia, they suffer from a lack of direct, specific evidence tying Legio IX Hispana to those theaters. They do, however, highlight that the mid-2nd century was a perilous time for legions beyond just Britain. Multiple legions did disappear in that era, so the ninth could have been among them somewhere between the Euphrates and the Jordan, rather than the Tweeds in the Highland glens. Other hypotheses and legends. Beyond the major theories discussed, there are other possibilities and more fanciful legends that have been proposed regarding the ninth's fate. While these are often less supported, or not supported at all, they form an important part of the ninth's mystique and are worth exploring. One possibility is relatively mundane. The legion may have been disbanded for political reasons rather than physically destroyed. The Roman emperors sometimes punished legions that disgraced themselves by disbanding them. For instance, a legion that mutinied or performed poorly could be dissolved, its remaining men dispersed into other units, and its title struck from record. Effectively, a bureaucratic death sentence. Could the ninth have been disbanded? If it mutinied in Britain or elsewhere, as the Hadrianic War scenario imagines, Hadrian or a later emperor might have decided to dissolve the legion and wipe its record. This would look much the same in surviving evidence as a military disaster. The legion abruptly vanishes. A hint of this comes from the theory of a London-based revolt. If the ninth actually joined a rebellion, Rome would certainly not trumpet that fact. They would prefer to quietly pretend the legion never existed. There is no direct record of such an order for Legio IX, but it remains a conceivable scenario. The ninth died in shame, not in glory, at the hands of fellow Romans. On the opposite end of evidence-based reasoning, we step into the realm of legend and folklore. A particularly colorful legend, though relating more broadly to lost Roman legion rather than specifically the ninth, is the tale that a lost Roman legion ended up in remote parts of the world like China. Over the years, some popular writers and sensational headlines have conflated the story of the Ninth with this legend of Romans in the Far East. The story in question actually originates from the aftermath of Crassus's defeat at Carrhae 53 BC, where some Roman prisoners were said to have traveled east and possibly served as mercenaries in Central Asia. In the mid-20th century, a scholar named Homer Dubs speculated that those Roman mercenaries might have founded a village in China called Liqian, explaining the villagers' European-like features. This has been largely debunked by modern DNA tests and lack of archaeological evidence. Liqian's people showed typical Central Asian ancestry, not uniquely Roman. Importantly, that legend pertains to a much earlier time and to a different legion. Still, because the Ninth is famously lost, it sometimes gets incorrectly linked to any lost legion myths. There is no credible evidence that Legio IX Hispana traveled to China or became wandering mercenaries on the Silk Road. That is firmly in the territory of French speculation and misidentification. Similarly, one might encounter the whimsical idea that the Ninth Legionaries, after a defeat, settled among the very barbarians who defeated them, perhaps intermarrying and living out their lives far from Rome. While not impossible in individual cases, some captives surely became slaves or assimilated. The notion that the entire remnants of the legion formed the community somewhere is not supported by any record. If they had, one might expect at least a genetic or cultural trace in Britain, akin to folk tales or unique grapevines, but nothing concrete has emerged. Within Britain, local folklore in some areas does recall the presence of Roman soldiers. In the Scottish borders and Highlands, there are vague tales of a lost legion wandering in the mists, ghost stories of Roman soldiers sing marching at night, eternally searching for a home. These are likely inspired by knowledge of the Ninth's legend, rather than independent traditions. One site, Newstead near the Scottish borders, was a Roman fort that some romantics once fancied as a possible last stand site, though archaeology there doesn't specifically support that. And as mentioned, Burnswork Hill in Dumfries, with its Roman assault ramps and thousands of lead slingshot bullets, has been called the site of Rome's training ground, or perhaps a brutal example of Roman firepower in action. At one point, people wondered if it could be connected to subduing a revolt, maybe the one that claimed the Ninth. But evidence leans to Burns' work being either a training exercise or a later Antonine-era clash, not necessarily tied to 120 AD events. Another French theory that occasionally surfaces is that the Ninth Legion's number was simply renamed, possibly to cover up a shame. For example, there were cases where legions that suffered disgrace would be reconstituted under a new name or merged. If this happened, the Ninth might have continued existence under a different designation. However, we have a pretty good record of new legions formed in the 2nd century, and none seem to correlate to the Ninth's disappearance timeframe. Thus, that idea lacks traction. In summary, beyond the rational explanations, the Ninth Legion has accumulated a kind of mythic aura. It stands in for the idea of a lost military unit, doomed by fate or folly. In popular imagination, it's not unlike the later stories of the lost colony of Roanoke or the vanished Norse of Greenland, a historical whodunit. This has naturally drawn creative theories. In the case of Legio IX Hispana, the fringe and legendary accounts enhance its mystique. They serve as modern folklore, whether it's an image of a battle-weary Roman survivor trudging into the unknown steppes, or restless spirits of legionaries still guarding the northern hills. These are testament to the Legion's powerful hold on our imagination. They remind us that the Ninth Legion exists now as much in the realm of story as of history. Archaeology and scholarly investigations. The mystery of the Ninth Legion's fate has not only been a playground for storyteller, it has also been a serious puzzle for historians and archaeologists. Over the years, scholars have doggedly searched for clues and inscriptions, ancient documents, and excavated artifacts to piece together what happened. Each new find or analysis has either added a piece to the puzzle or caused a reevaluation of earlier assumptions. The quest for the truth of Legio IX Hispana is, in a sense, a detective story, one conducted through Latin inscriptions on stone, stamped clay tiles, and the careful interpretation of careers of long-dead Roman officers. In this section, we will explore what the tangible evidence tells us and how scholarly opinion has shifted over time. Perhaps the most crucial pieces of evidence are the epigraphic records, inscriptions on stone and tile, that mark the Ninth's last known whereabouts. We already noted the York inscription of AD 108, commemorating the rebuilding of a structure by the Ninth at Boracum. This inscription firmly establishes that the Ninth was still active in Britain, at least until 108, and presumably for some years afterward. That stone, preserved in a museum now, literally carries the Legion's name, a proud but poignant reminder carved shortly before their disappearance. Fast forward to the 20th century, when a breakthrough occurred far from York and Nijmegen, Netherlands. Archaeologists uncovered stamped tiles bearing the mark of Legio IX Hispana. The first of these finds emerged in the mid-20th century, and more followed in subsequent digs, notably published by R.P. Wright in 1978, and later by Willem and van Eckevoort in 2009. These tiles were likely part of a bathhouse or buildings of a legionary base. Importantly, they include the stamp LEGVIIIIHISP, along with the phrase VEXBRIT, Vexillatio Britannica. A vexillatio was a detachment, often drawn from a parent legion for special tasks or campaigns. The combination of IX Hispana and British detachment suggests that a unit of the Ninth Legion from Britain was present at Nijmegen, likely around AD 120, give or take a few years. This find was paradigm shifting. Until then, the predominant idea was that the Ninth had been destroyed in Britain before 120. But if some of them were in Nijmegen after 120, then obviously they weren't all dead in 119. Initially, Some thought the entire legion might have been transferred to Nijmegen. However, further study indicated that only a part of the Ninth may have been there, possibly a task force or subunit, not the whole legion at once. How do we know? For one, Nijmegen had been home to other legions before, and by the 120s, it wasn't a permanent base for a legion. Also, only a small number of 9th Legion stamps were found, not the sort of epigraphic footprint you'd expect if a full legion relocated and built extensively. It seems more plausible that a vexillation of 9th Hispana was stationed there temporarily. Perhaps they were supporting a construction project or reinforcing the Rhine defenses during a quiet period in Britain. One theory is that this detachment could have later continued on to another destination, possibly towards the Danube or to join a war. In any case, the Nijmegen evidence effectively debunked the simplistic notion that the Ninth must have died in Britain in 117, as had been commonly believed mid-century. Modern scholars thus adjusted the timeline. The Ninth likely survived in some form up to at least 120 AD, and possibly even a bit beyond. The ripple effect of this is seen in academic publications from the late 20th century. Historian Shepard Frere in Britannia, 1987, noted that the old conjecture of a 117 annihilation had no solid evidence, and that the Ninth likely continued into Hadrian's time. Similarly, Eric Burley, a respected expert on Roman Britain, stated there is sufficient epigraphic evidence to indicate that the 9th Legion was still in existence well after AD 120, and none to support the old conjecture that it was destroyed earlier. This consensus held that the 9th Legion's fate should be sought in the 120s or later, not around 117 as Mommsen thought. So where does that leave us? The epigraphic trail after 120 is extremely scant. We rely on indirect clues, often in the form of prosopography, the study of individual people's careers. Several officers who served with the 9th have been identified. For example, an inscription tells of Lucius Novius Crispinius, who was a tribune, a senior staff officer of Legio IX Hispana at one point in his career. His later career included being a legionary legate in the mid-2nd century, and eventually a consul designate. By estimating the progression of his posts, historians attempt to pin down when he was a tribune of the 9th. Crispinus likely served in the 9th in the early AD 120s, because tribune was an early step, and he was moving up by the 130s. There are 2 other known tribunes of the 9th whose careers continued into the mid-2nd century. The key observation is, all these men had normal subsequent careers, implying that serving in the 9th did not end their life or prospects abruptly. If the 9th had been obliterated in 117, we'd expect their tribunes to perhaps die or at least have a gap. Instead, their timeline suggests the 9th was intact when they served, around 120 to 125, and they moved on around or after that. This indirectly supports that the 9th Legion survived into the 120s. Now what about Hadrian's Wall in the 6th Legion? Archaeology has tried to refine exactly when Legio VI Victrix replaced IX Hispana at York. Traditional thought is that 6 Victrix arrived around AD 122, possibly brought from the German front by Hadrian, and that it helped build the wall. Yet, an interesting study of building inscriptions on Hadrian's wall shows that most inscriptions by 6th Victrix on the wall include the word refexit, rebuild, rather than fecit, build, suggesting that many of those marked stone date from repairs in the late 2nd century, not the initial construction. Hodgson interprets this to mean Legio VI may not have been heavily involved in the wall's first phase. Could it be that the 9th was still around in 122 to start the work? Or perhaps vexallations from other legions did the initial building, while 6th was getting situated. This is complex, but it implies our timeline might need nuance. The 9th could have left Britain perhaps a little earlier or later than 122, and 6th Victrix was fully operational at York by, say, 125, after the wall was substantially done. In any case, the handover period, 120 to 125, is murky, and both legions' activities overlap then. What is clear is that by 130s, Legio VI Victrix was firmly the legion in York, and the 9th was gone. Archaeologists have also looked for any telltale signs of a massacre or a battle site related to the 9th in Britain. This is challenging. How to distinguish the 9th's bones or gear from any other legions? Still, none of the excavated Roman battle sites, like those from Boudicca's revolt or later 2nd century skirmishes, have produced an obvious smoking gun like equipment marked with the 9th's emblem en masse. If the 9th died in Britain, one might expect a large grave or many stray artifacts in one area. None has been confirmed. For example, on some Scottish sites, Roman armor pieces and skeletons have been found, but they can't be tied uniquely to the 9th, as multiple campaigns occurred in those areas. Another piece of the puzzle is ancient legion lists. We mentioned the monumental list in Rome circa 165 AD that omitted IX Hispana. Another list, recorded by Cassius Dio for the time of Antonius Pius, around AD 158, also omits the 9th and counts only 30 active legions when there had once been 32, implying 2 were gone, likely the 9th and the 22nd. So by circa 160, both had vanished. This helps bracket the time of disappearance. No later Roman document, for example, the roster in the late 3rd century Notitia Dignitatum, includes a 9th legion. It was never reformed. Rome essentially wrote it off. Modern scholarly investigations often play out like historical cold case detective work. For instance, Duncan B. Campbell, a researcher of Roman military history, took on the 9th's mystery in detail. He compiled the epigraphic evidence and the prosopographic data to see what the last likely scenario is. Campbell's analysis, published in The Fate of the 9th, 2018, leans towards the legion not being destroyed in Britain because of all the reasons above: stamps in Nijmegen, careers of officers, and more, which present evidence mainly epigraphic with minimal speculation that the legion appears in later Eastern campaigns. In other words, Campbell suggests the Ninth possibly did take part in one of those later wars, like the Parthian War of 161, and met its fate there. His conclusion, while acknowledging it's not universally accepted, is considered state-of-the-art, essentially the most informed guess given current evidence. The Ninth was not obliterated in 117, but likely lasted a bit longer, and ended in obscurity, perhaps in the East. Interestingly, while Campbell's work might suggest an Eastern end, other experts like Hodgson revived arguments for a British end. This illustrates a healthy scholarly debate. In 2021, Hodgson strongly argued that all evidence can be interpreted to allow a demise in Britannia by 122, and that we should not rule that out just because of the Nejmegen finds. Hodgson, in fact, tried to reinterpret those officer careers, like Crespinus, in a way that they could have served in the Ninth earlier, so that the legion could still be gone by 120. Campbell and others find such stretching unconvincing, but it shows that how one reads fragmentary data can lead to different stories. To an outside observer, it might seem perplexing. After decades, experts haven't solved this mystery, but this is not due to a lack of trying. Rather, it's a testament to how tiny scraps of evidence and their interpretation can shift narratives. The case of the Ninth Legion often serves as a case study in historiography, how historians construct an account from limited data, revise hypotheses with new finds, and sometimes have to live with uncertainty. As Adrian Spooner commented in reviewing Campbell's work, the case is still open. All this is to prepare for the possible disappointment of discovering that the case is still open. In other words, despite all efforts, the fate of the Ninth remains unconfirmed, a rare gap in Roman military history, given how well documented most legions are. The ongoing investigations include not just papers and books, but also archaeological digs. The 2010s and 2020s saw renewed interest. For example, the Arbea Society's 2022 conference specifically focused on Hadrian's Wall, the loss of the Ninth Legion, and conflict in the Hadrianic period, drawing together experts to weigh the evidence for war in Britain under Hadrian. Topics included those London finds, events on the frontier, and even the siege works at Burns' work as possible connections. This shows the scholarly community is still actively testing theories, hoping perhaps some new inscription or a better dating of known evidence might tilt the balance toward one scenario. It's worth noting that archaeology deals in probabilities. We may never find a monumental inscription that reads, "Here fell Legio IX Hispana in battle against the barbarians." The Romans didn't advertise defeats, but we might find, say, a tombstone of a Ninth Legion centurion in a place unexpected, like a Parthian site or deep in Caledonia, or a papyrus letter in the sands of Egypt referencing the legion's fate. Each scrap could be decisive. Until then, what we have is a kind of historical mosaic with missing tiles. The outline of the Ninth's history is clear until a point. Then large sections are blank. Scholars fill those blanks with educated conjecture, continually refined. In summary, archaeological and historical scholarship provides these firm points. The Ninth Legion existed and was active through AD 108 in Britain. It likely participated in events up to around 120, possibly sending a detachment to the Rhine frontier. It was no longer in Britain by AD 122, replaced by the 6th Legion, and by the mid-130s, it had ceased to exist entirely. The gap between 120 and 130 to 160 is where all the mysteries lie. Was it war in Britain or war abroad? Mutiny or redeployment? The evidence is tantalizingly mixed, allowing for multiple reconstructions. One could say the search for the ninth is almost as illuminating as any answer would be. It has taught us much about the nature of Roman military records, the dangers legions faced, and the storytelling of history itself. As each generation of historians revisits the problem, they bring new techniques or perspectives. It's a fine reminder that history is not a fixed set of answers, but an evolving inquiry. Cultural legacy and modern myth. While scholars sift through clues, the public and popular culture have spun the fate of the Ninth Legion into modern legend. Indeed, the cultural legacy of Legio IX Hispana is outsized compared to many other Roman legions, precisely because of its mysterious end. The Lost Ninth has inspired novels, films, TV episodes, and countless references in literature and art. Its story, or rather the ambiguity of its story, provides a perfect canvas for the imagination. It is dramatic, tragic, and a little eerie. Let's explore how the Ninth Legion saga has been portrayed and memorialized outside academic circles. The most pivotal work in cementing the Ninth Legion's legend in modern times is Rosemary Sutcliffe's novel The Eagle of the Ninth, 1954, aimed at younger readers but enjoyed by adults as well. This historical adventure begins after the Legion's disappearance. Sutcliffe conjured the tale of a young Roman officer, Marcus Aquila, whose father served in the Ninth. Marcus, determined to restore his family's honor, ventures beyond Hadrian's wall into the wild north to discover the Legion's fate and reclaim its lost eagle standard. Sutcliffe's vivid storytelling imagines that the Ninth was ambushed and annihilated in the Scottish Highlands, but some survivor, including Marcus's father, lived on among the tribes. The climax involves finding the eagle of the Ninth Legion hidden in a tribal shrine, a powerful symbol of Rome and the Legion's spirit, and bring it back to the Empire. While entirely fictional, the novel was rooted in the then popular belief that the Ninth had indeed perished in Caledonia. Sutcliffe even drew inspiration from a real artifact, the so-called Silchester eagle, a bronze Roman eagle figure found in southern England. Though that eagle was not actually a legendary standard, likely a decorative eagle from a building, in the novel, it becomes the iconic lost standard of the Ninth. The image of an eagle standard, lost and retrieved, is so evocative that it stuck in popular memory. Many who know nothing else of the Ninth know they lost their eagle in Scotland. Sutcliffe's influence cannot be overstated. Her novel has never been out of print, and has been translated widely. It captured the imagination of a generation, embedding the story of the Lost Legion in British culture. It even spawned a sequel of sorts in legend. People sometimes speculated that a Roman eagle found anywhere in Britain might be the ninth eagle. Visitors to Reading Museum, where the Chichester eagle resides, often recall Sutcliffe's story as if it were partly true, a blending of fiction and history. The success of the Eagle of the Ninth led to multiple adaptations. In 1977, the BBC produced a television series titled The Eagle of the Ninth, dramatizing Sutcliffe's story for viewers and further popularizing the Lost Legion myth. More recently, filmmakers revisited the subject. Kevin McDonald's film The Eagle, 2011, starring Channing Tatum and Jamie Bell, was a Hollywood take on Sutcliffe's tale. It followed the broad strokes of the novel. The Ninth vanishes, and years later, its commander's son seeks the truth and the eagle, venturing among hostile Pictish tribes. The movie even opens with text that boldly states the Ninth marched north and was never heard from again, and that Emperor Hadrian, furious at the loss of the Legion's eagle, built a wall to seal off the north. This is more myth than fact. We know Hadrian's wall had broader strategic motives, but it shows how firmly the Ninth's disappearance is linked to the wall's story in popular minds. Neil Marshall's film Centurion 2010 took a slightly different approach. It depicted the Legion's final campaign and massacre in Scotland in graphic detail, essentially dramatizing the moment of destruction, with Michael Fassbender as a surviving centurion leading a band of survivors. Centurion leans heavily into the gritty, violent possibilities of the tale. Pictish warriors hunting down the fleeing Roman survivors, one by one. Both films, though different in tone, one a quest, the other a survival thriller, derive their premise from the same source, Sutcliffe's popularization of Mumson's theory that the Legion died in Scotland. The Ninth Legion also pops up in less expected cultural corners. For instance, the long-running British sci-fi show Doctor Who dedicated an episode to the Ninth's fate, The Eaters of Light, 2017. In this story, the Doctor and companions arrive in 2nd century Scotland to find out what happened to the Ninth Legion. It offers a fantastical twist. The Legion wasn't simply defeated by humans, but rather fell prey to an otherworldly monster, the Eater of Light, that devoured the soldiers from the shadows. A handful of Roman survivors end up teaming up with local Picts to trap the creature, sacrificing themselves in the process. In the end, the Legion vanishes because they heroically chose to remain in an interdimensional portal, fighting the beast for eternity, explaining why history never recorded them again. This whimsical, eerie tale reflects how even in science fiction, the Ninth's legend is intriguing enough to explore. The episode is notably atmospheric and a bit melancholy, playing on the poignancy of young soldiers lost forever far from home, a tone very much in line with the Legion's mythos. Literature beyond Sutcliffe has touched the Ninth as well. For example, Stephen Pressfield's novel The Profession, 2011, makes a passing comparison between a modern lost battalion and the Ninth Legion, showing how the phrase Lost Ninth is shorthand for vanished military unit. The concept also appears in alternative history or speculative fiction. Some writers have imagined what-if scenarios. What if the Ninth survived and founded a breakaway state? Or what if a time traveler could discover the truth? These are niche, but they underscore that the Ninth's fate is seen as an ultimate history mystery. The Legion's mystique has also been kept alive by reenactment groups and local heritage. In York, for example, where the Ninth was based for decades, museum exhibits often mention the Ninth's disappearance as a hook to engage visitors. There's a certain pride in local connection to this famous mystery. Reenactors occasionally don the tonica and lorica segmentata, a Roman armor, with the standard of Legio IX to march in parades or historical festivals, commemorating the Legion's presence in tantalizing end. Such events keep the memory semi-alive, almost the way one might honor a lost regiment from a more recent war. One interesting cultural side note: the phrase "the Lost Legion" has entered idiom partly due to the Ninth. Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem, "The Lost Legion," not about the Ninth per se, but the term has been used in context from colonial armies to sports teams that disappeared. Yet, whenever one says the Lost Roman Legion, it's the Ninth that first comes to mind. It's telling that of all Roman legions, the Ninth is the one with a catchy epithet, the Lost Legion. This nickname appears even in factual lists. In public-facing media, the Ninth's fate is often presented as an unsolved mystery, akin to the disappearance of Amelia Earhart or the fate of the princess in the tower. The interplay between scholarship and popular culture is also evident. When new academic theories arise, they sometimes find their way into fiction. For instance, if the London Revolt theory were to catch hold, we might see a novel or film that dramatizes the Ninth fighting street to street in Londinium, or a Legion mutiny narrative. That hasn't happened yet, likely because the Northern legend is so entrenched and romantic. But it shows how even fringe theories can inspire fiction, much as pseudo-histories of Roman Britain have inspired alternate histories and novels. Pop culture has also occasionally misused the Ninth story in humorous or trivial ways, such as a comic strip in the Asterisk series where a legion gets lost. Role-playing games in video games set in Roman times sometimes reference a lost legion as a quest or a backstory. Why does the Ninth tale resonate so much? Perhaps because it embodies the fragility of even the mightiest. A Roman legion was the premier fighting unit of the ancient world, symbol of order and power. The idea that such a unit could simply vanish, leaving no clear trace, is intriguing and a bit haunting. It's a reminder of the limits of empire and of the fact that even Rome had its dark secrets and defeats. In a scholarly sense, it's a caution that our historical record is incomplete. And in a human sense, it provokes empathy. 5,000 men and their families who never knew their ultimate fate recorded. It's an open ending, inviting everyone to imagine their own ending. Thus, culturally, the Ninth Legion lives on precisely because we don't know what happened. Each retelling, from Sutcliffe's noble quest to Marshall's brutal survival to Doctor Who's supernatural spin, adds a layer to the legend. And each new piece of historical evidence that emerges tends to generate new media interest, articles in mainstream press, segments on news. One can see the ninth story as bridging past and present, history and myth. On a quiet evening in York, one might wander by the remnants of the Roman fortress walls and imagine the sounds of the legion within, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the drill of a soldier on the parade ground, the chatter in the barrack blocks. Those soldiers were real, and their routines prosaic, and yet, somewhere, their stories escaped the pages of history and became legend. The cultural legacy ensures that whenever we speak of legions and mysteries, Legio IX Hispana will always be remembered, perhaps marching forever in the borderlands of reality and myth. Conclusion. The story of the Ninth Roman Legion is one of history's enduring enigmas. We began with its formation in the Republican era, followed it through hard-won battles and postings across the Roman world, from Italy to Hispania, from the banks of the Danube to the foggy Isle of Britannia. We saw the Ninth Legion participate in triumph and endure disasters, quelling Spanish tribes, clashing with British warriors, nearly annihilated by Boudicca's revolt and Caledonian ambushes, yet persevering. By the early 2nd century AD, this legion had already outlived many peers and earned its place in Rome's order of battle. And then, quite suddenly, it slips from the record. In the soft, late afternoon light of historical memory, we see a final glimpse. Legionaries of the Ninth carving an inscription in stone at York in AD 108, unaware that they are about to become ghosts in the chronicles. After that, silence. The Ninth Legion vanishes into time's shadows, leaving behind a tantalizing void. What followed was not the end of the ninth story, but its transformation. In the absence of fact, a legend was born. Theories have swirled like mists on the Scottish Highlands. A brutal end at the hands of northern tribes, a secret rebellion, an obliteration in Britain's heart, a redeployment to distant wars where they met a nameless doom, or perhaps a quiet administrative disbandment. Each theory we explored, whether backed by stone inscriptions, literary hints, or imaginative leaps, adds a thread to the tapestry of the Ninth's fate. Today, the consensus among many historians is that the Ninth likely did not simply disappear in one fell swoop in 117. Instead, they probably lasted at least into the 120s AD, and whatever befell them happened after that, possibly in conjunction with Hadrian's reorganization or the later wars of the empire. Yet, the debate remains spirited. It is fitting that a mystery of this magnitude retains multiple working answers. The story of the Ninth Legion invites speculation, thoughtful or bold, precisely because no single account has closed the books. In a sense, the men of Legio IX Hispana march on in our collective imagination, whether one pictures them fighting valiantly to the last on a heather-covered moor, or trudging along a dusty eastern road to face an unknown enemy, or being scattered by internal strife. The end is invariably poignant. The image of a lost legion resonates. It symbolizes lives given to the empire, perhaps taken for granted, and then forgotten by the imperial annals. The ninth's absence from official records might well hint at some disgrace or embarrassment to Roman pride, an incident authorities prefer not to immortalize. And so, ironically, by trying to erase the Legion's final chapter, they ensured it would never be forgotten. The silence screamed for explanation. We also saw how archaeology works to give voice to that silence. Every shard and inscription is a whisper across 19th centuries, and scholars have learned to listen carefully. We lean in to hear the faint testimony. The letters written on a fragment of tile telling us, "We were here after you thought us gone." A casual remark in a general's letter, "So many were killed by the Britons under Hadrian," hinting at an untold calamity. A list of legions with a name missing, speaking volumes by that omission. The pursuit of the ninth has thus been a journey of discovery in itself, one that teaches patience and humility before the past secrets. In reflecting on Legio IX Hispana, one is drawn to the human element. Imagine the legion's final movements. Whichever theory you favor, envision those Roman soldiers, perhaps mostly provincial recruits by then, Spaniards, Gauls, Britons, Italians, under the eagle that had been their symbol of honor for generations. Perhaps it is dawn on a freezing morning beyond the frontier. They line up in battle formation, their breaths clouds in the chill air, as painted warriors emerge from the fog. Or perhaps they are in the arid hills of Armenia, fatigued from a long march, eyes widening as they realize they marched into a deadly trap. Perhaps they are in the streets of London, shocked at a sudden revolt, fighting amid familiar buildings turned hostile. In any scenario, we sense their courage and fear, their discipline and desperation. A centurion barking orders, a standard bearer holding the eagle aloft, young legionaries locking shields in a last stand, and eventually, in eerie quiet, broken only by the wind or the footsteps of victors among the fallen, a legion has died. Yet not entirely, for the ninth lives on every time we recount its tale. The end of the ninth legion is not recorded in any scroll, but it has been rewritten in countless forms in books and films, each writer giving them a different ending, almost as if offering the legion a kind of immortality through story. Few military units from antiquity have achieved that kind of mythic status. In this way, the Ninth Legion achieved in death something unique. It became a legend, ensuring that its name would echo through the ages, even louder than many legion whose fate were ordinary. As we conclude, we allow the ghosts of the Ninth Legion to retreat back into the mist from whence they came. The sun sets over the ruins of a Roman fort, perhaps the one at York, or an imagined one beyond the wall. The standard with the bull emblem lies fallen or hidden, and the voices of men speaking Latin fade into the evening breeze. We are left with reverent silence and lingering questions. History, in the end, guards some of its mysteries closely. The fate of Legio IX Hispana may remain one of them, unless fortune grants us new discovery. But even if we never conclusively learn the truth in this ancient mystery, perhaps that is okay. The mystery itself has value. It invites each generation to engage with the past, to think critically and creatively. It has certainly ensured that the Ninth Legion is remembered 2 millennia later, a very rare achievement. In a final reflection, we might say the Ninth Legion's story is a mirror. It reflects the rigor of historical inquiry and the richness of human imagination. It reminds us that behind dry designations like Legio IX Hispana were real people, thousands of lives whose fate, though unknown, mattered. It also reminds us that history can sometimes be like a half-forgotten lullaby, soft, elusive, hauntingly beautiful in its incompleteness. We end our narrative on that note, letting the lost Ninth Legion rest in knowledge that they will be summoned again in stories around campfires, in classrooms, and in quiet contemplative moments by those who find the past as mysterious and magical as the finest tales. And so, the Ninth Legion marches on, forever lost and forever found in the annals of history, in the realms of myth.